This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project's conversation series. 6 months after the historic mass people's uprising in Bangladesh, which led to the fall of the Awami League government and the flight of Sheikh Hasina, a haunting silence remains. There is no definitive list of those killed by law enforcement during the protest between the 16th of July and the 5th of August 2024. Families are left without answers, justice remains elusive, and the machinery of impunity grinds on. On January 15th, the Tech Global Institute, in collaboration with the International Truth and Justice Project and Outsiders Movie Company, released a landmark body of work, Bloodshed in Bangladesh, a forensic report documenting the 148 killings that took place on July 19th, and two investigative films, Jatarbari and Ghazipur, which reconstructs the final hours of the protest, state violence, and the killing of the 20-year-old Mohammad Ridoy. These are not just simply documents, these are archives of grief, resistance, and reckoning. Today, we are joined by the four people who were instrumental in this body of work, each offering critical insights into how information was gathered under the conditions of blackout, how narratives of atrocity were contested, and how memory and truth itself are being preserved in the aftermath of state terror. Joining us today is Dia, who's the executive director of the Tech Global Institute, joined by researchers Sams, Apun, and Arafat. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to start by setting the context and kind of laying out the work. So, Dia, the first question is to you. What prompted the Tech Global Institute to take on this digital forensics and archiving initiative in the aftermath of the Bangladeshi uprising? Was there a moment that made this urgency clear?
Yeah, thank you so much, Chitra, and thank you, the Police Project, for having us here. I think a couple of, I guess, sort of, I would say, triggers in terms of, having being Bangladeshi, having witnessed such an historic event, and having gone through, and for the past almost 2 decades of political repression, media repression, and living in an environment where truth was oftentimes sort of under the wraps. Truth kind of lost its ground. I think it was particularly important that in the July uprising, or July Revolution, I think the process of documentation began much before the uprising had ever ended, or we had ever predicted that the former prime minister was going to resign, or had to be forced to leave the country, because um, again, having been through multiple sort of years of repression, I think we were very worried that the truth was going to get undermined, and then there will be a different story about what happened during this protest. And so we started the documentation work back in early July, because we were seeing a lot of content coming up on social media. There was killings happening. There was obvious evidence of law enforcement attacking unarmed protesters, and we felt that this was we were worried that this was all going to be lost, and somebody had to just do the work immediately to start documenting and archiving that. And I think that's where the process had started, because we did not want this body, or these significant human rights abuses, these killings, to basically go unnoticed, unaccounted for ever in history, because of the history that Bangladesh has had in the past 2 decades. So that's when the work kind of started, but then it really galvanized, after the regime fell on August 5th. There was an immediate need that, okay, all this has happened. How do we move forward from here? What does justice look like for us? How do we actually reconcile the truth? How do we make sure that people don't forget why this revolution happened in the first place? That so many people were killed. There was a UN fact-finding report as well that listed that 1,400 people have been killed during these protests. So I think we felt quite this new steam added to our work, that we needed to kind of move forward and really start documenting meticulously, so that people will know that sort of what happened, how it happened, and the fact that most of these killings were completely unprovoked, and it was done very intentionally and deliberately, to actually to unarmed Bangladeshis by their own government. And I think that documentation was particularly important, given the political moment that we were existing in at the time.
Um, and it's really interesting, and you start by saying that how things were getting lost. Sam, so this question is for you. You are working in a landscape where physical evidence is quickly getting destroyed, so is digital evidence, and is often denied. And the states control most of the narrative. So how did this idea or the tool of digital forensics become your tool of resistance?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this arrangement. Thank you, Polis Project. So, so I can address this question starting with giving you a glimpse. When we are talking about atrocities, when we are talking about massacre, what actually we are referring to? You can we can say that hundreds of them were 18 years old or younger. Hundreds of them were shot on head and throat, and dead bodies were piled up on vans. And we also have seen in some cases that mass burial took place in Bangladesh in different places, and even set on fire on bodies. So as this all of this going on the top of that, there were internet shutdown, there were restricted access to social media. But even all of these things happening, there are number of videos and images surfaced online from social media as well. So and we kind of understood that something horrible is going on. So I think that where this digital forensics thing came into the scene. And if I give you a single example of Mohammad Ridoy, that incident happened in Gazipur. We saw that police carrying away the body of Mohammad Ridoy to an alley close to the Konabari police station. And we still do not have any clue where the body is right now, and how they managed to do something like that. So these are the things that probably are a matter of concern. That how can we reconstruct those stories, those events. So, and another thing is there are a lot of disinformation. Obviously the government is still on the was is still on the power. So they tend to change the narrative. There is it's so obvious that they will not give an actual number, the actual number. So even we have seen that some official stated that the person who was killed for the first time on July 16th, Abu Saib. The officials used to say that he has kind of association with probably fundamentalist Islamist group. So these kind of narratives they tend to impose and try to downplay the extent of the atrocity. So we started to try to understand what weapon they have used, and through the citizen recorded footage. And these all of these things actually provided us the lifeline for digital forensic and for the resistance.
Thank you so much for that. Dia, I'm going to come back to you. So, you worked at that intersection of tech regulation and human rights. So, why was it important for you that this project not just document what happened, but to prove how it happened? And I think there's a very clear distinction between the two. And again, you've used videos, satellite data, time code analysis. Can you walk us through the decision?
Yeah, I think the how is quite important because, as Shams was kind of alluding to, back in July when the protests were still happening and the previous government was still in power, there was a lot of denialism at the time that we were attacked, therefore we did it in self-defense. We did not use lethal weapons. There was a lot of narratives, and that really undermined what was like you said, sort of how not just the fact there was some consensus. Maybe people were killed, but they were only killed because it was in self-defense, right? So that how became even more important. And I think it's not just in Bangladesh, but across the world when we see state sanctioned violence happening. It's happening in Palestine right now, it has happened in Syria, it's happening in different parts of the world. There is a tendency that the attacking state or the oppressing state ends up taking a very different position on mostly on the how. They don't deny sometimes what happened. They're like, yes, people were killed, but they were killed under a very different set of circumstances than what is being than what actually happened, right? So I think the how of that was particularly important because it was important to demonstrate the fact that this was brutal, that this was completely unprovoked, that there was a very deliberate decision on the government's part and the part of the security forces to go and kill people, and that these are fundamentally crimes against humanities and these are atrocities, and there is no other way to really mm, say it, right? And I think that that element of that was very important in kind of establishing, because of how we have seen around the world, how sort of narratives change, how the stories are getting lost. So I think that's one sort of major trigger for it. But I think the second aspect of that was also, even right now, if you see present day Bangladesh, um, big the lack of documentation means that there is always an opening for interpretation. But these are, in many ways, I would say, quite black and white. A group of protesters were trying to protest. The security forces received commands from their political government, and then they went and killed a bunch of people. So I think that the fact that even that denialism was not just an element of what was happening at the time under a previous government, but is also an element of what's under right now in interim government, and that there are people, in the country, outside of the country, who continue to kind of push and harbor that uh, this didn't happen the way we said it was going to happen. I think for that very meticulous reconstruction is important, because it then was able to show sort of the sequence of events, what led to what, the causalities around it, and therefore really establish the fact that these were fundamentally atrocities and crimes against humanity. And I think that's a direction that we wanted to head from the very beginning, because any kind of documentation, especially this level of documentation, needs to be, very very detailed, so that it not only serves the work of public memory, but it also ends up refuting denialism. It also ends up being particularly also used for criminal proceedings, as and when we can kind of use them. And I think that level of reconstruction and detailing is important for those
Yeah,
reasons.
I'm going to open this next question up to all of you, so please answer as it feels right. At Polis Project, for us, archiving is a political act. And when we encountered your work, we realized that the idea of archiving is just as political for you in this context as well. So, within this context of the work that you've done, what does it mean to preserve video evidence, the metadata, family testimonies? Again, of course, you've said it's important for legal accountability, but also for public memory. So, can you walk us through that?
Well, in the context of Bangladesh, archiving is inherently a political act because it challenges the state's monopoly over history, narrative, and truth. From the suppression during protest to the erasure of extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearance, the state often controls what is documented, what is remembered, and what is forgotten. So, in such an environment, preserving video evidence, metadata, and family testimonies becomes a form of resistance. It preserves the evidence, it recognizes the human cost, and it keeps the memory alive. For example, in 1990, mass uprising was a democratic movement that took place on 4th December, and it led to the fall of General Hussein Mohammad Ershad in Bangladesh. So, in that time, there was no internet, there was no smartphone, and a little visual evidence. So, if we look at that archive of that time, there will be only news from some newspapers and TV channels that are publicly available. We know that media has its own agenda sometimes, and they under pressure from the authoritarian government, they show a subjective reality. So what we have found in 2024, we also observed that the majority of our news media were portraying this protest in different ways. They were focusing like on how public assets like television channels, office and metro rails have been vandalized instead of thousands of killings. And as expected, after 5th August, they turned 180-degree position from their previous position. So if any outsider who doesn't know the context of our political environment and tries to discover what is going on here and to do some research on July Revolution, if they try to do their research based on those news archives that we have broadcasted in our news channels and newspapers, that will be a mistake. So this is where we are working on. We are making a digital archive And this type of archive actually will make us remember what they want us to forget actually. So that was from my side.
That's an incredibly powerful way to articulate so much of what communities across the world resisting. I quickly want to go to the number of people, the number of deaths that I included in the report. Sams, I'm putting this question to you. How did your team verify the number of deaths and cross-check the 148 names included in the report? Were there discrepancies between the official record and community testimonies?
All right. So, as we started our journey as a digital forensics team, so we have a true broader source of this digital evidence. One is open source, like from social media, media reports, and everything, and other is on the ground collaboration. So, yeah, we as a digital forensics team, we focuses more on the analysis part, but we have collaboration with ITJP and other organization who collected these data, and we directly reach out to those families of victim. It's like probably it's 136 of them. Reach out to them and then also confirm to the other 12 deaths. So at the on the top of that, we also consulted a number of human rights organizations such as Manavadikar Sanskriti Foundation and Human Rights Support Society and Odikar, and also cross-verified with a number of newspaper, our national newspaper like Prothomalo and Daily Star. So, talking about the discrepancy, obviously we talk about there is a well-known intention or that government will try to suppress or control the number of actual the ground reality of the situation. So the initial media report stated that probably 48 or 56 in between that on the July 19th more are likely to be killed, a number of people likely to be killed, but our investigation shows that the actual number is three times higher than that, so it's 148. So yeah, this is for my part.
They are in Jatarbari, the contrast between the army and the police behavior is very visually clear. How did your team use video forensics and satellite footage to build a timeline and a map of accountability?
Thanks for that. I think it's important to the I mean, kind of see the security sector in a very significant nuance, because what may be true in one location may not be true in another location. And so, yes, in Jatarbari particularly, there was a distinctive difference between how the police and the army behaved, and that's what we were also that's what the videos had shown as well. In terms of the actual process of reconstructing the events, I think it's a combination of both open source investigation, but also witness accounts. So we not only used the digital evidence, but we also went back to the various families or eyewitnesses that were present there at the moment, and trying to also recreate, what they saw and what they remember, right? And I think it's very interesting, because I think, part of the South Asian identity in some ways is we have a bit of a soft corner or a bit of a leniency towards militaries. So I think that narrative reconstruction also demonstrated the fact that, yes, when the police were advancing, the military was trying to, and the army were trying to calm down the protesters, that they were trying to negotiate with the police. So we see that being recreated even in the narratives as well. And I think we were hearing this a lot, but we did not actually see it unless, or really could confirm this was actually happening, until and unless we saw the videos, right? And I think that's how they complement each other, because typical investigation would entail eyewitness accounts and kind of, talking to all the people, talking to both sides. But I think the video element kind of, and the satellite element also kind of added new layers to that information, because we were not only hearing things, but we were also trying to see, okay, if there was a claim made that a group of people were retreating, where would they retreat to? And so we may not have videos of that, but we had the satellite footages, so we could see which street in which direction Would that be safe? Could they be cornered? What was the distance between the police station and the actual alleyway? So I think these very very specific, very sort of meticulous measurements and documentation, and then I guess helped us, I guess, truly kind of reconstruct what had happened, how it had happened, and whether the claims that were made by eyewitnesses was actually kind of also backed by other forms of evidence. And I think we wanted to have an airtight understanding of what was happening in front of Jatrabari. The other aspect of that is, you know, I think when you experience tremendous amount of trauma and you watch people die in front of you, there's also a tendency that your mind starts protecting you, right? And you remember the event very differently, or you miss out very important details. So one of the particular important details, particularly in the Jatrabari film, was the fact that at one point a stun grenade was thrown at the protesters, and we were not sure, what exactly this was. Was it thrown by a member of the law enforcement? Was it thrown from inside or outside? Which direction it was going. And that particular moment was very important to identify, and it's a very small detail, but it's a very important detail because that, in many ways, if you see the Jatrabari film, was really the beginning of all end, right? Because once that was thrown, the crowd dispersed, and other things have happened. And so these are the kinds of details that you get when you start reconstructing events, not just based on eyewitness accounts, but also based on digital footage and digital forensics, because then you're able to see a much wider set of realities and a much wider set of how things have evolved, that then starts really narrowing down, it gives us a more comprehensive view of what happened, and it becomes almost a second by second analysis of what happened. And I think that's especially important in a situation like this, because we're trying to also um, understand attribution, understand provocation, understand intention, and all of that is perhaps where we see the value of digital evidence.
Thank you so much. Because when we were preparing for this conversation, one of the things that we did was invest a lot of time really looking at all of the work you had done. And one thing that really stuck out to me was that how the detail really does affect the grain of history, and the way you lay it out, the team has laid it out in terms of the reports, especially in terms of the two films. That grain is really absolutely important, the way even we think about history and perceive what happened on the ground. So thank you so much for that. In the film Ghazipur, you reveal an execution and the subsequent disappearance of this young man, Mohammad Ridoy. We spoke about him earlier in this conversation. Maybe give us a little bit of context, but also how did you corroborate this sequence with satellite imagery and witness testimony?
Okay, I will address this question. So, in case of the Riddler's execution, so we have analyzed at least 33 videos to reconstruct the events of the execution and disappearance of his body. So, to pinpoint the precise incident locations seen in the videos, we identified some key landmarks like the name of a shop or the address written on the door of the shop. So, these landmarks were then thoroughly cross-referenced with satellite imagery to verify the incident location observed in the videos. So our analysis and the satellite imagery showed that Ridoy was executed in front of a hospital called Sharif Channel Hospital in Gazipur. So his brother-in-law stated in a testimony that Ridoy was forcefully taken to the road by some police officers and then executed by shot to death. So, in our analysis, as we have observed in the film, and in our analysis, we were able to verify his testimony that he was actually taken to the road by forcefully by the police. So, after the execution, his body was taken to the nearest police station, and since then, it has not been seen again. So, his parents told in various interviews with media that they had not received their son's body yet and complained that the police had concealed his body after the execution. So that's how we corroborate this sequence of execution with satellite imagery and other witness testimony.
Thank you for that. I now want us to go into this issue of disinformation. Apul, this question is to you. How did the state attempt to control the narrative around the protests and killings? And what kind of digital disinformation campaigns did you track?
In addition to the internet shutdown, the former government also shut down various social media sites, including Facebook, WhatsApp, and TikTok. So at that time, political propaganda was being spread by many Facebook pages through the promotion of political advertisements. In our research, Meta's ad library report shows that more than 80% of the advertisements share pro-government content in that time. Some of those advertisements were about how the opposition party is supporting and participating in violence, how various government buildings and state assets were being damaged. There are some descriptions of various acts of violence by protesters and third parties. There are some advertisements where about some information about attacks and atrocities were happening against law enforcement forces. And there are also some content like the movement is a rise of fundamentalism and we should stand up against the protesters. So after broadband service were restored on the limited scale on 23rd July, the tide of spending on advertisements began on July 24th. And despite Facebook being down for 7 days from July 24th to 30th July, a total of at least 33,000 plus USD was spent on pro Awami League political advertisements, which is equivalent to about 4 million Bangladeshi currency. So in August, we published a research on these things titled How Online Disinformation Fuels Religious, Ethnic, and Socio-Political Tensions During Bangladesh Regime Change from Tech Global Institute. Our analysis shows that the majority of disinformation spread false narratives to undermine the student-led movement. Discrediting protesters has been observed as a tactic to question the credibility of the student-led movement and to deflect attention from the core issues. Like some example, students were caught with weapons, drugs, and money. BNP, Bangladesh National Party, which is the opposition party of Bangladesh Awami League, and Jamaat Shibir, some political party joining the movements with their weapons. And there are also some disinformation like arms are being given to students by Chhatra Shibir, which is a student wing of Jamaat Shibir. So this disinformation we debunked. We did a research on this, and I think I would say that this disinformation actually was produced to influence the majority's impression on this protest. That was from my side.
Thank you for that. So, this report and films not only center deaths but also the bureaucratic cruelty, right? Like, it's not just deaths, it's like denying access to the dead bodies, postmortems being resisted, funerals being surveilled. So, you're also dealing with digital timestamps and timelines, but also how did this affect your approach to interviewing families, especially while preserving their dignity, while documenting the immense loss and trauma that they've experienced?
Can I just add into that, if it's okay, Suchitra,
Sorry,
in terms
sorry,
of,
sorry.
I think I think one of the key elements of any kind of archiving work and preservation work is consent. This is, and it's interesting because the I mean, we worked very close with ITJP, who had an on-ground group of investigators in place, and so they were very much in contact with the families from the very beginning. But a big part of that data collection and evidence collection was, really getting their consent in terms of, this is, we're collecting this is the purpose, whether we're going to actually use them for. We're not going to give it to these other people. So I think really meticulously laying out what that information is going to be used for how long, in which ways, who's going to have access to that. I think that level of transparency was really important for how we built in the collection process. And that really kind of helped us also understand and, I would say, embody consent throughout that entire investigation. So one was obviously the eyewitness accounts, but then we also went back to the families saying, hey, we have this one video from this one eyewitness about, your brother, your son, your family member, your sister, your mother. Would you like to see it? What does this look like, right? So I think that process of giving the families control, giving the eyewitnesses control, and taking their consent and making them part of what we were trying to do is very important. And it's not important just because it's the right thing to do and the ethically right thing to do, but I think it's also important to build greater ownership and understanding around justice and accountability. And it's also important because in many ways it's not really closure, but I think it is a very important part of coming to terms with what happened, and what happened to somebody you dearly dearly love. And I think that process for us was very important, that we involved everyone from the very beginning. And even when we were releasing the films, like Sham said, it wasn't really about us, it was really about the families were on stage, they spoke. We wanted them to decide how they want this to be, and some families left the room, some families said, I don't want to watch it. uh, I know what happened. I don't want to watch it. I don't want to watch it unless until justice has been served. So I think there's a lot of power in really bringing in, kind of going in that way, in the sense that you are centering around the people who are most impacted, and this becomes part of not just a very technical process or a very legal process, but also a process of mental healing, and a process of reconstruction that helps families um, either have some level of closure or have some renewed conviction that it is that they're not alone, they're not isolated, and that we are collectively all trying to get towards accountability, and we all want that public memory to be restored. One of the most powerful things I think we heard during this process was family members coming up and saying that there's obviously any protest, there's a couple of iconic figures, right? Because they kind of become the symbol of protest, but there's 1,400 people who died per the UN report. Not 1,400 people become iconic in terms of public communication, but they did sacrifice their lives. So many families came and would tell us that, my only ask is that through these investigations, through these films, you help to make their sacrifice almost part of that public legacy, right? That this was sacrifice was not in vain. They were not just a casualty, they were not just a collateral damage of a much larger thing. They were very much there in that place, and making a very deliberate choice to fight for Bangladesh and Bangladesh's freedom and Bangladesh's democracy. And I think that particular moment, I think for us was almost a light bulb moment, that yes, we're not doing it just for all of these very complicated reasons, but also because these families want to be seen, and they want to be recognized, and they want to make sure that these deaths were not in vain. And I think that is really part of that whole preserving and kind of ensuring that there's dignity throughout that process. Is perhaps these spaces also become, especially in environments where there is a lot of digital controls and media suppression, it becomes an alternate media, and it becomes a place. I mean, and it's important to say this with a lot of caveat, that it doesn't mean social media platforms are doing something right. It means that people were able to find more use of it than what it even intended to be used for. And I think, if you go all the way back to, for example, many of the protests in Syria, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Ukraine, there's, and Myanmar, for example, there's a lot of discussions around evidential preservation, right? So not just social media role and the kind of content that fuels violence, and there's preservation of that, but also the role of platforms when it comes to archiving, right? How long are you going to store data for? How many, what kind of videos, can a prosecutor request information from you? Can the ICC ask for that? And I think there's a lot of that perhaps existed in the ICC submission for Palestine by South Africa. A lot of that was really that preservation piece that came up. So I think it's complex in the sense that there is that duality of how much you want to control, and then but also much larger question about what is the role of these very private spaces, and I always say it's very private. These are also very private memories in many ways, right? You're making it public, but sort of who owns it? Does the user still own it? Does the platform own it? Does the prosecutor own it? Like, whose story is being told? Because all of the fundamental rules of publishing, all the rules of consent, all the rules of ownership and attribution are kind of lost when it comes on a platform like any of the social media platforms. So I think a lot of that work that we are now trying to do is really trying to understand, to your question, what is the role of platforms in spaces like this? Are platforms credible sources of documenting crimes against humanity? What is the role of in atrocity documentation? And there's some really interesting work that other researchers have done at TGI, looking into the role of platforms and archiving, and particularly in contexts where media controls are suppressed. And identifying what are the kinds of thresholds and safeguards and policy changes that needs to happen within platforms so that they can be a more effective tool of archiving without ceding control to them, because it goes both ways, so it's complicated that way.
Thank you all so much for this incredibly powerful conversation. So, I'm going to put one last question to all of you. After all of this work, what does justice look in work like this? We spoke about Mohammad Ridoy, but really the many, many, many others who've lost their lives for freedom, for a better reimagined future. What does justice look like in relationship to your work?
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit more on that one, perhaps in the sense that, I mean, what does justice look like for us? I think justice would mean that, I mean, at a very, very primary level, that people stop denying what had happened and how it happened, and the fact that there was uh, a government that attacked its own people, that unleashed its own security forces on its own people, and that ordinary people who had no role, who are completely unarmed, were killed without provocation. That's what happened. And there was a regime that did it, and they have 16 years of violence and human rights abuses, and under their belt. And I think, first, I think this idea of, I think, kind of refuting denialism, I think it's a very big part of it. But I think if we move beyond that, the I mean, our hope with this work was that this level of reconstruction and this level of documentation will then help us actually get closer towards justice. And by justice, we mean that perpetrators who are responsible, are kind of go through fair criminal proceedings. That the families see that the people who pulled the trigger, or people who ordered for the trigger to be pulled, are going through some level of accountability. Whether that is from trials, to whether it's going to jail, to kind of what that outcome would look like. But I think a fair trial, a fair criminal proceeding, a transparent criminal proceeding that actually involves the families, involves the various actors. I think that's what we would want. But I think at a much larger and grander level, I think what we would want is no such thing to happen to anyone in the world, right? We don't want a regime like this to ever return again. We don't want police to feel like they can go and kill a bunch of people and be allowed to kind of walk on earth freely. We don't want people to disappear. And I think a huge part of this effort is not just that public memorialization, but also seeing that this documentation aids towards criminal accountability in a way where, before the next time there is a regime, the next time people feel like I can get away with it, they will be reminded that you can't get away with it, and that there is a very real consequence of it, um, and that justice is being served to those who were impacted, and those who inflicted that kind of violence on honest people. So I think that's what it looks like for us, that we are actually able to see um, the 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 that these are not repeated ever again, and that the people who are impacted see eye to eye with their perpetrators, and are able to see that their perpetrators are being held accountable for their actions.
Dia, thank you so much for that closing remarks, and thank you all of you for joining us. As someone who, as an organization that works on documenting communities in resistance, this work is important to us in so many ways. And as you said, we do not want this repeated. And somehow, being South Asian, it feels like this violence and trauma keeps visiting and repeating over and over again. So I want to thank each of you for your courage, clarity, and commitment to truth, justice, and to families who are still waiting. What we've heard today is not just an account of a massacre, but an indictment of impunity, a documentation of state violence, and an archive of voices the Bangladeshi state tried to erase. Through the reports, bloodshed in Bangladesh, the Chatarbari, and Ghazipur, you have preserved what the regime attempted to silence. Thank you for naming the dead, and you've made space for the grief while also holding their dignity, often very hard things to do. Thank you so much for the work you do, but documentation is only the beginning. For those of you listening, please read the report, watch the films, and share them. We close today by honoring the lives taken and the people who refuse to let those lives be forgotten. Thank you so much. And again, as I said, read the report, watch the film, and thank you for your work.